Okay, great. All right, I am now recording. So, hi, Rabbi.
Hi.
I'm so glad that you're here and so grateful that you took some time to talk to me and to my students about this incredible topic that you really have helped our world explore, and that's exploring God and spirituality with children. So, I wanted to get a little bit of advice and insight from your perspective. Firstly, why did you create books for children exploring God and spirituality? This was not a norm, not when you did it, not now. This is something different. Tell us about why you made that decision.
Well, I made the decision because I had two young children, and I also was involved in teaching children in our religious school at the synagogue. And I could not find any books about God that I felt I could share with my own children and the ones I taught. I felt the books said things that I didn't believe and that I would probably later have to correct with children as they grew up. And I wanted to find a way to talk about God that opened a conversation with children. The God is a huge, complex topic. Thousands of books are written on this. We needed to have a book that's opened a conversation and helped children engage the kinds of questions they were exploring in their lives. So actually, it really began with an experience with my own daughter, who's now grown and has children of her own. But when she was 5, she came home from a Jewish day camp and handed me a picture of a lovely looking grandfather. And I said, "Oh, tell me more about it." She responded by saying, "You see, they asked me to draw a picture of God." And she looked at my face and she said, "Don't worry, I know God's not a man." But when I first handed them a blank paper, they said I had to draw something, and this was all I could think of. And at first, I was quite impressed that my daughter recognized you can't actually make a concrete image of God. But then I realized she was 5, and a blank page was just that. It was blank. And here she had this vivid imagination. And when she was forced in some ways to imagine God, she only had one image, and that was a grandfather. And so I wanted to write about ways that children could use their imagination to think of God in ways that related to their life. And that was the first book, which is called God's Paintbrush, which was in some ways revolutionary in its time. It took me 6 years to publish it. I had many rejection letters because it was either too religious for the trade publishers or it was too outside the box for the religious publishers. But fortunately, I found a publisher, and it sold 100,000 copies. And what was fascinating about it is there was a series of vignettes that enabled kids to see the divine and the sacred in their everyday lives. And each vignette ended with a question to invite a conversation. And what kids and parents have told me is that the questions are so crucial to the reading of the book, that kids really want to talk about this. We just haven't given them permission to do so.
Amazing. And was that response once it was published? Did you get a lot of that feedback quickly, or did it take a while? I would imagine because it was such a new and different type of resource, there would have been varied responses initially. Because now when I think about that resource, it's well known, it's the best of
Right.
the best, it's a standard in the early childhood classroom.
Well, first of all, that's wonderful to know. I mean, actually, as people began reading it, I got really strong positive feedbacks. People really liked having this conversation with kids. I remember a father saying to me, "Normally my wife reads when my child goes to bed, but she was busy and I took over the reading. And I decided I wanted to get through the book quickly, so I left out the questions. And my daughter said, 'No, Dad, ask the questions.'" And then in many cases, kids would tell me, "You know what I like best about this book?" And they'd answer themselves by saying, "I like the questions," which is an indication that, kids really want this conversation. And those who are afraid of it are adults, partly because they're not sure what they believe, and partly because they think you have to be some kind of expert to talk about a subject that of God and theology. And actually, neither are true. You don't have to know what you believe. You just have to be exploring. You don't have to have answers to a question. You just have to say, that's a really big question, and I've been thinking about it. Can we think about it together? And really, there are no experts. Um, you of course, that it was an expert who built the Titanic, and it was Noah, an amateur, who built the ark. So that you just have to be willing to explore this really important area of life.
So you've created a lot of resources since you created God's Paintbrush, and you sort of set the stage, and now there are other people who have written books and other sorts of resources. There's a market for this now that I don't think was there. Can you tell me a little bit about what you'd recommend when people are looking for resources, when teachers are selecting materials that are going to support them, either when they're specifically addressing a part of their curriculum or when something comes up in the classroom or community that provokes these types of questions?
Absolutely. So, first of all, it has to be a good story. If you don't find it compelling and interesting and you want to know what happens, then kids aren't going to like it either. They don't want to be preached to. They don't want a sermon. They don't want to be told exactly what to believe. They want to have a story in which they can find themselves. So a couple of criteria that I think are really important. Of course, the language should be clear enough to be comprehended by children. It shouldn't hide behind big abstract language and words. Secondly, it needs to be rich enough in images and characters to be meaningful. And thirdly, it should be concrete in the way that it relates to their world. So, for example, God's Paintbrush deals with very concrete circumstances that children find themselves in. And fourthly, you could say it should be critical in the way that it is open to a continuing conversation. It doesn't give you an answer, because when you're talking about spirituality and the divine, God and the sacred, there are no answers. It's not a black or white response. So what you want to have is a book that's going to allow an ongoing conversation. I did a lot of storytelling when I was a young rabbi, and I always felt I had to tell the moral at the end of the story, because I figured, well, that's my role. I'm a rabbi. I'm supposed to, give a little sermon story and say, now, it's clear what you learn from this is the following. But as I learned more about storytelling, I realized this was a serious mistake. I was simply telling children what the story meant to me, and I had to allow them to figure out what the story meant to them. So when I do storytelling with kids, and I think of this also when I read children's books with them, I ask a couple of key questions, questions that don't have definite answers, like, what did you think was the best part of the story? You kind of want to know where the child, is really engaged in the story, what do you think is the most important part? And to me, the most significant question is, where do you see yourself in the story, or what part of the story is about you? That's when you can really have an important conversation. And you are at a different place in your life. So the story means something to you that may be very different from the children you're teaching. And it's a real gift to hear where children are within this story that you're sharing with them.
That's great advice, really, I guess, when we're exploring any topic with children. I'm sure that the educators will find that really widely applicable. Is there any other advice or thing that you think is critical for those of us who are in this sacred and sort of vulnerable position to facilitate these conversations with kids should know? You probably have had more experiences of this nature than the average rabbi, and I wonder what we might be able to glean from the richness of your background and experience.
Well, I wanted to say something about the importance of story. If I had time and I was going to design a curriculum, I would design the whole Jewish curriculum around stories. So when I I taught the holidays, they would be stories about holidays. When I taught ethics, it would be stories about generosity or compassion, because I really feel that narrative is the way children live their lives. So there's a wonderful quote, I think it's by Jerome Bruner, but you can correct me if I'm wrong, that says, if remember that Wendy came to tell the Lost Boys and Peter Pan how to tell stories, because if they knew how to tell them, they would be able to grow up. I feel really strongly that we can help our children grow up by using narratives. And it's fascinating. I mean, I've had young people who I taught as children come back to me as adults to say, I was really thinking about that story you told me when I was in first grade. And I think now I want to tell you what I'm thinking about it. So while you think that children aren't paying attention, they probably are. And the story may not mean anything to them at the moment, but a year later, it may mean something to them. So I can give you an example of this. In God's name, people call God by many different names. And when I would tell this story, I would ask the kids, what's your favorite name for God? And, what experience leads you to name God? And so this young man, he had heard the story when he was a child, and he ended up in the Persian Gulf War, and he was an intelligence officer. When he came back, he called me and said, I have an answer to the question you asked many years ago. I now know my name for God. And it is my trampoline, because it's what enables me to bounce back after I fall down.
Wow.
So just value story, and whenever you're trying to teach, see if you can find a really good story that allows you to have that conversation and highlight what you're trying to communicate, because those experiences are even more important than the information you're communicating.
Fantastic. Well, I will make sure to include a link to all of the stories that you've written at the bottom of this, wherever it winds up being posted. And I just want to thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me today.
Great to be here, and nice talking to you as well.
All right, thanks. All right. Now hold on, let me turn the recording off.